Hello, this is Professor Hushain Amir Ahmadi of Rutgers University and President of the American-Iranian Council. On June 13, I heard a speech by a high-ranking security and military officer of the Revolutionary Guard of the Islamic Republic that I think it's worth bringing it to you. I will not repeat the speech as it was given. I will make my own presentation of it and add some comments. But I will remain completely loyal to the ideas of the speech. The speech was given in three parts. In the first part, he focused on the ongoing fight against corruption in the Islamic Republic. In the second part, he focuses on the matter of Iran selling gasoline to Venezuela in exchange for gold. And in the third part, he focuses on the events following the George Floyd's in the United States, the protests, and concludes that the US is in decline. He finally makes a few concluding remarks that I will also share with you. I believe the most important part of the speech is, of course, the middle one, in my view, that is the matter of selling gasoline to Venezuela in return for gold. But let me just touch on the first part, which is the current fight against corruption in the Islamic Republic. Obviously, the judiciary, now headed by Mr. Raisi, the current head of the judiciary, has decided to fight high corruption and big corrupt people, major corrupt people. I believe the officer focuses on this part for a reason, and that reason is to basically connect the corruption in the Islamic regime to the government of Mr. Hassan Rouhani, the current president. Indeed, he specifically names Mr. Tabari, who used to be sort of the second in command, of the judiciary before Mr. Raisi under Mr. Sadiq Larijani, and says that Mr. Tabari had connections with Mr. Daniel Zadeh, who is the biggest sort of like debtor of the Iranian banks. He has basically borrowed over 4,000 I've got 4,000 billion Iranian toman from the banks, never paid, and that he was assisted, helped in this corruption by Mr. Hossein Freidoun, a brother of Hassan Rouhani, the current president. So you can see how the man is trying to get Rouhani, his brother, and that corrupt businessman with this corrupt official in the previous judiciary together. Basically saying these are the corrupt people, and that corruption at the end of the day emanates from this government and his people and those who are in Mr. Rouhani's even family, the brother. So I will, in the conclusion, he in fact does return to this matter and says the biggest problem Iran today faces is internal, not external. I will explain that. And that the internal problem is a weak, corrupt government, and that is Mr. Rouhani's government, that needs to be eliminated. And of course, there is an election coming, and he says that in the coming election, this government and his supporters will be over, that a new executive branch will come into being. The new president and the cabinet will be revolutionary, powerful, and basically from military security and other Iranians. Well, that is exactly what happened in the last parliamentary election in Iran, that this current parliament is now controlled by the military, security, and revolutionary people. So the officer basically says, what you saw happen during the election for the parliament will also happen in the next election, which is due within a year, to the executive branch. And he thinks after that, after we have that powerful government in place, then things will change in Iran for better. Because in his view, Iran's problem today is internal, not external. And why it is not external, and here is the key arguments he makes using the case of Iran-Venezuela exchange of gasoline and gold. This part is extremely important. The officer presents his speech in this particular part in 3 or 4 sections. First, he says that, well, the Islamic Republic had to sell gasoline because the corona had reduced the consumption of gasoline in Iran by 55%. So there is lots of gasoline that needs to be dispensed. He says that Iran doesn't have even the storage for the refined gasoline that it is producing now, given the decline in domestic consumption. And these extra gasolines have to be either kept in the ships in the sea, in some storage, but largely has to be exported. And that is why he says we needed to export this, and then we took this challenge, the challenge of exporting gasoline to Venezuela in return for gold. He says that so we took that challenge first and foremost because we needed just to sell our gasoline. But he said that wasn't all that there was, that it wasn't just an economic matter of the sales that they undertook. He says it was the strategic and political sides of this exchange that was very important. He says, for example, that Iran was and is very short of gold, and that we needed to build up our gold reserves. And he said to build our gold reserves, we just had to sell this gasoline in return for gold. And he says they got 9 tons of gold from Venezuela in exchange for this gasoline, the 5 ships of gasoline they sent. He reminds his audience that one reason that the late Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown by the CIA and the British intelligence was because the country was short of gold, and when they sanctioned and they boycotted the purchase of Iranian oil, the country had nowhere to go and had no resources to use. So this reserve of gold and an addition to this reserve, he says, is extremely critical for our resistance to American maximum pressure policy. So again, we sold the gasoline to Venezuela for the economic reason, but also for the fact of the building up the country's gold reserve, which is critical for its survival in the wake of American maximum pressure. But then he says there was another reason that we took this challenge, and that's very, very important. And he says we took this challenge because we wanted to make a statement to the Americans. And that statement was that we can actually infiltrate your backyard. We can challenge you right in your backyard, which is the Caribbean and the Latin American waters. And that not only we are not afraid, that you will not be able to do anything. And he says this was our major goal, the perhaps goal, purpose for taking that challenge. The economic side, the gold, and this strategic challenge to America, right in its backyard. In this part, he makes a few interesting statements about Iran's defense postures and policy. He says that in the past, the Iranian governments have been very, or regimes have been very dependent on major powers for their defense and security. The Islamic Republic is not, and that the Islamic Republic has proven to be independent of foreign powers, east or west, and that it has stood its own, place. So he says that first we are independent from a defense perspective or security. Second, he says that not only we resisted this foreign powers and that we did not become dependent on that, but that we increasingly focused on internal resources, and we build up our defense capabilities internally, that we build our potentials. So we cut off our dependence on others. We build up domestically what we could on the basis of our resources in terms of defense. And third, he says, this build-up, that independence and this build-up of domestic power made us to become capable of preventing foreign powers, the US in particular, to think even attacking us or ordering us around. He said, we have achieved that level of capability so that America doesn't even dare to attack us. I said, if America knows why that is the case, because we are powerful domestically now. In fact, he makes a very interesting statement. He says, when America murdered Qasem Soleimani and we took revenge by hitting Ain al-Assad military base in Iraq of the US, he says, we prepared 100 missiles ready to be fired, but we only fired 15 missiles hitting Ain al-Assad, left 85 untouched. And he said, why we did it? He said, because we thought to wait to see what the US does. If US had attacked back, our plan was to fire all that 85 missiles to Israel and basically destroy that country to some extent. And the officer says in this speech that America, the US knew that, and therefore it did not take action against our missile attack to that Ain al-Assad military base. In fact, he very emphatically says the reason America doesn't dare to start a fight with the US is first and foremost because it knows that if a war starts between Iran and the US, the first thing Iran will do is to hit Israel and destroy it. And therefore, for the sake of Israel, America doesn't attack us and will never attack us. Of course, he says, besides Israel, the US knows that we will also hit its military assets and bases in the region. And that is another reason that the US wouldn't touch us military-wise. So this is the third part of his thing. He says, first, we became independent of the superpowers for our defense. Second, we built up our internal power, defense power. Third, we basically used this power when we had to, in response to attack to us. in response. He said that we have also developed a condition, a situation where that we have tested America in the region by taking on its military assets and so on, making it to them to see that we can in fact even initiate a conflict, although he says that is not what we wanted to do because our purpose is preventive. At least it has been thus far, he says. But he then goes on and says that this last experiment, with this, gasoline and gold exchange was a completely different one. Here, we move to another stage in our posture and policy, defense policy. Here, we did not respond. We did not do anything reactive. We were proactive. That is, we took the challenge of sending 5 ships to Venezuela through the waters of Caribbean and Latin American neighborhoods. So he basically says this is a completely different stage. We wanted to tell America that we are now beyond just a preventive policy of a reactive policy, but that we are now proactive, that we can challenge and we will challenge. But then again, he says, what we wanted to show to America is that we now have the initiative in our side. We are the one that takes initiative, not you, which you had in the past and making us to react. This is, he says, is a completely different stage in Iran's defense policy. That sort of, and instead of in moving gradually from a preventive defense to a defensive defense to an offensive posture, from a defensive to an offensive posture. A big statement. I would say a dangerous statement, extremely bold, extremely unrealistic. But that's what the officer claims is on the table now in Tehran, that Tehran is moving gradually away from preventive, defensive to offensive postures. And he gives this case of Venezuela an example. Now I will come back to that in a second. And then in the last part of his talk, he goes on to talk about the American decline, and that he, to his credit, he doesn't say that America is collapsing, quote unquote, but that it is declining. It's a declining power as opposed to a collapsing power. He thinks, however, that the trend is toward that collapse in the foreseeable future. But for now, America is just declining. And incidentally, he makes a very interesting statement here, and he says, Tehran believes that if Joe Biden, that is the Democratic Party, was to take over from President Trump, this decline will speed up and that the collapse will come sooner. In a way, the Revolutionary Guard seems to favor the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party will make the American collapse come sooner. That is, they obviously dislike the fact that if Trump was to win, the US will be around and it will be a challenge. Now, let me, at this point, to pull together my own observations about this speech. As I said, the middle part of the speech is extremely important. That the way he says, he talks about that Iran moving from defensive to offensive posture in relation to the United States in particular. And he says we can do it not just because we have built up our domestic capabilities, that we have no dependency on any power for that defensive capability, that we, in fact, have reached a point where preventing the enemy from attacking us is no more an issue. That we already have passed that stage, that we are secure, safe, nothing from outside is a danger to us, to our existence. And if someone, the United States in particular, of course, was to attack us, he will say that we will, in fact, take care of Israel and the American assets in the region. And the Americans know that, and therefore they will not do this as well. And therefore, even if we were to challenge to be on the offensive side of this challenge against the US, the America will just simply sit back and take that offensive challenge and will not respond to it. This, he thinks, the officer thinks, is the show of Iran force. Iran is now, he says, is a power. And that America, directly or indirectly, have recognized it. But then, as I've said before, Iran's foreign policy for a long time has been no war, no peace with the United States. I think the officer is exaggerating the Iranian power, because we have seen that when it comes to serious American challenge against Iran, Iran will compromise and come to the negotiation table and make concessions, as in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal case. I think that the officer is exaggerating, but I think he is exaggerating it for a reason. He is exaggerating it for domestic purpose. He knows that the Iranian military is no match for American military, that in any war, the Iranian military will be immediately destroyed. And that if the United States did not challenge Iran's ships taking gasoline to Venezuela in return for gold, I have said, and I believe it was a pre-arranged deal between the US and Iran. Venezuela needed gasoline. The US didn't want to sort of like, put that much pressure on the Venezuelan people. So it allowed Iran to send the gasoline. But at the same time, they were negotiating exchange of prisoners and so on. So it was a deal. This officer doesn't talk about the deals that were made behind the scene, that he doesn't talk about the exchange of prisoners and so on. But nonetheless, because he's such a high-ranking security and military officer, his words are important. And I must also say that, interestingly, he ends up by saying that this challenge to America didn't come from Rouhani's government, a weak government, a corrupt government. It came directly from the leader, Khamenei, and the Revolutionary Guard. The leader made the decision, the Revolutionary Guard took the action. And the government of Hassan al-Rouhani stood on the sideline, even criticized the action, because the officer thinks this Rouhani government is a dependent stooge, and that weak, and that he is just not capable of taking the kind of actions or policies or decisions that Khamenei is taking or making. Now, as I said, he concludes by saying that Iran's problems are largely internal, because externally, he says, we are secure. No war. America will never dare to start a war with Iran, because we are powerful, and that we have Israel in our neighborhood that we could destroy, and American assets as well. So therefore, in the officer's view, there will not be a war between US and Iran. I also think that there will not be a war between US and Iran, but for a particularly different reason. It will not be, has not been, because the Islamic Republic has been able to convince America, Israel, and others that the best option for everyone is a no war, no peace status quo. That any time America went toward the war side, the Islamic Republic made compromises and the US returned to the center. And any time the center moved a little bit toward the peace side, the Islamic Republic refused, rejected, and took that peace back to the center again. No war, no peace. But one thing that I believe the officer doesn't understand is that the US policy may be changing, that they may not want to stay with no war, no peace any longer, that they may give Iran a war or peace option, and that will force Iran into a completely difficult position. Cannot fight, has to take peace, and that peace is destructive. At least as far as I am concerned, in terms of like, a dictator making peace with the US usually loses. But the officer says, as I said, the problem is not external, whether he's wrong or right. He says our problem is internal. In the internal, of course, there is one big corruption issue that Mr. Raisi, the revolutionary head of the judiciary currently, is fighting big time. And then, of course, there will be an election for the executive branch that will bring to power military and revolutionary forces, just like this last election brought revolutionaries and militaries, militarists to the Iranian parliament. So in his view, the officer basically gives this rose garden for the future of the Islamic Republic. And that rose garden is this, that there is no external threat. We have achieved a level of power that is not just defensive, that it could even be offensive and yet safe. And then he says domestically that we had a problem, it's going to have to be resolved very soon. The judiciary is going to have to fight corruption. Revolutionary government with the revolutionary parliament, which have major elements of Revolutionary Guard and other militaries into power, and they will then start building a whole new Iran, a radical Iran controlled by military revolutionary people, and an Iran that has already achieved a level of defensive power that the war becomes irrelevant to think even about. That's where he takes us to. As I said, I think his understanding of the US power is wrong. I am afraid that he is not being realistic, and that he is exaggerating the Iranian power, while at the same time belittling America's. America is a powerful country and Iran can never stand it, militarily speaking. I think he's also wrong by saying that just simply after the military and the revolutionary people take over the executive branch, problems will disappear domestically. It will not. Iran has serious problems economically, politically, socially, culturally, in terms of the environment, and of course it's in its foreign policy. Iran needs a tremendous change in all of these spheres, particularly starting with domestic politics. And I believe the best way to move forward in that particular area is to is to build a process of negotiation between the opposition and the government for transition to a new political system in the country. And that a political system that will not challenge the US or Israel, but rather makes peace with them, get rid of sanctions, utilize domestic resources and foreign resources to build a better Iran. My only hope is that this speech is only a propaganda speech for the followers of the officer or his listeners, that is the military and the revolutionary people, but that he himself is more realistic about the American power, the Iranian power, and the domestic problems of the country. And that he and his colleagues will understand what is at stake for Iran in all of these areas. Iran is rapidly moving in the direction of self-destruction. I hope that will be stopped. My only hope at the same time is that the military people will understand this better, take the challenge, and change Iran. Because I believe the mullahs, the clergy, will never be able to take initiative for change, the change that is required in the country. Only a military power may be able to do it. But then again, that power, military power, has to be realistic and has to join the Iranian people as they move forward for a better Iran, moving away, moving beyond this religious theocratic regime in Tehran. The only option Iranians have is to move from this theocracy toward a better Iran. And I believe in that process, this military forces, which this officer claims are so powerful, all right, let's use that power domestically. Just don't show it to the US. Use it domestically to make the change for a better Iran.